Hello, and welcome to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation professional webinar. Today we have a very special guest, one of our own, Dr. Marco Baptista, PhD. He leads the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation's mission to advance cures for spinal cord injury and paralysis. He provides oversight of the research portfolio and a collaborative approach to accelerating the field towards meaningful treatments. Welcome, Dr. Baptista.
Thanks, Linda. So happy to be here.
So let's just dive right in. And could you talk a little bit about what led you to work in paralysis research? How did you get here to this place?
Sure. I started off my career studying neuroscience, and then more specifically, behavioral pharmacology. My work started where I was trying to understand the reward systems that exist in the brain. And then it led to me going into industry, where I then joined Schering-Plough, which then became Merck in New Jersey. And there I was leading a Parkinson's program and also working on Alzheimer's programs. It was while I was in industry that I saw the power of what a nonprofit can do. And I was really collaborating quite a bit with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's. Ended up going there and spending 10 years leading their translational department and trying to bring therapies forward for Parkinson's. And then after 10 years being at the Michael J. Fox Foundation and working with a lot of companies and seeing the power of what we can do in collaboration with industry and academic partners, I started to explore what I could do in another really exciting space. And I was hearing a lot of exciting things about the innovative science occurring in spinal cord injury, specifically around electrical stimulation. And thought it was an exciting time for me to explore that avenue. And I think there was a desire for sort of fresh eyes to look at spinal cord injury and try to identify problems and obstacles and apply learnings that I did when I was at the Michael J. Fox Foundation to the SCI community. So that's what.
I would just add my own opinion that your time at the Michael J. Fox was very successful. And so we're very happy to have you here.
You.
So duplicate that, please. And more. Tell us about how the research process works at Reeve. There's confusion in the community because sometimes people think that the foundation is a place where they give money to individuals to support their personal rehabilitation goals. And it's kind of divided where there's the research component and the people who are living in the now component. And so I call it the Christopher side and the Dana side. But so tell us how does this research component work at Reeve?
Sure. Yeah. So at the highest level, we have a very holistic approach in dealing with spinal cord injury and paralysis. So we talk about the care side and the hundreds of thousands of people that have been helped by information specialists, all the different institutions and nonprofits that have been supported by the quality of life grants to help increase accessibility. And that's all complemented with a research side, which is what I lead, where we are trying our best to speed up a very slow process. And the slow process is device and drug discovery and development. And we want to ensure that as we're providing such amazing resources on the care side, to ensure that we're looking to the future and to make sure that the research is going as quickly as it possibly can, so that we can get regulatory approval for transformative treatments for individuals living with spinal cord injury and potentially also with different types of paralysis.
And so within that, if somebody wanted to participate in the research, what would qualify you to join the Reeve Foundation and apply for grant money to conduct a study? Who gets to do that?
Yeah, so I'm relatively new to the foundation. It's been about a year and a half. Ideally, I want to put into place something that is top down, where we can be very flexible. And if we're, I've been visiting a lot of different labs throughout the country and around the world. And if I see that there's really innovative science, I could be making a solicitation for an application where it gets independently reviewed by their peers to make a decision if we should fund a particular grant. That I've started in the beginning as a top-down process to really get the ball rolling. It needs to be balanced with a bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach would be more of not knowing where the answers are in the world, and so making a request for applications on a particular topic. And there's two requests for applications that we're starting to plan. One that hopefully will be launched this year, and I can talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. But it's really having a sense that sometimes we have an inkling of where answers might lie, and we need to support those groups. And these groups could either be academic groups, they could be small biotech companies, or they can even be large pharma. Even though we know they might have the resources to do a lot of things, they might not be allocating those resources for SCI. And we need to do everything we can to kind of bring them into our world. And balancing all of that with, in the future, having requests for applications, so that on our website, you'd be able to then just click and submit an application to us around particular topics.
So you would need to have some kind of research background.
Yeah, you would need to be affiliated either with an academic institution or a company. So you need to sort of be backed by resources, backed by some infrastructure to be, and this is common with all types of applications that go to different types of nonprofits. It's not to say that one individual might not have a great idea and want to move it forward, but the way to best move it forward is then to partner with an academic group or partner with an industry group, and then submit an application to us, so that we know that those funds are going to an individual with the proper qualifications, being an MD or being a PhD, so that they can then carry out the research within with the resources that they have.
So do you have any sort of plan or roadmap of how you would like to see the research progressing, so that it's not just like, well, let's try a little over here and we'll
Absolutely.
Do you have an organized plan, and how does that work?
Yeah, so I've been describing this plan as 3 pillars of research. The 3 pillars are catalyze, energize, and educate. So around catalyze, we want to support high risk, high reward types of projects. A lot of those projects will fall as early clinical trials. So you can imagine that an academic group or a small company might have a great idea. They've tested it on the lab bench. They've tested it in test tubes and petri dishes. But when a larger potential investor comes and asks them, do you know if this is safe in humans? A lot of the times that is a rate limiting step. The reason it's a rate limiting step is that it's very expensive to conduct that type of research in doing human clinical trials. And it's a very high risk to do that. That's a perfect opportunity for us to explore. So for example, we're exploring if epidural stimulation, which right now has been seen as something that has tremendous potential for movement, for blood pressure, but nobody knows if it's going to have potential, if it's going to be at first safe and tolerable for neurogenic bladder. That type of work has tremendous value if we're able to determine if it's safe for further investment to occur, but it's very costly to do it. So it's those types of projects that we really want to zero in and help support, because that will reduce risk in the field. Now, if the investor says, is it safe in humans? You say, yeah, here's the clinical trial that shows it. And you might now have groups that are willing to now take it to the next step. The next step would be, a phase 2 clinical trial where you're still looking at safety, but now you're really starting to check to see if there's a signal of it potentially working if it's going to be efficacious. So that's under our first pillar called Catalyze. And right now we have around 7 projects, mostly clinical, but we also have some preclinical work that hasn't occurred yet in humans, and making sure that that pipeline is going to be robust for us to, help support that type of work that's going to be translational for the field, and work that we know is pretty risky. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So that's under Catalyze. The next pillar, we call it Energize. And that is to ensure that we have more engagements with industry. And it's not to say that industry will be the solution to everything, but industry has the resources and they have certain expertise that you're not going to find in an academic institution. And so we need to make sure that industry is engaged with us. And we've one example of that. We just had a SCI investor symposium, and this is something that we can put a link up of our SCI investor symposium, so that all the talks are recorded and you can see them all. And we were really trying to engage with industry in a way that they haven't been engaged before. Thank you. I see that it's up there. So we had 6 companies that all presented on their different programs, their competitors, and yet I think as a neutral convener, as we are, the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, we can bring these groups together. We partnered with a company called Lineage Cell Therapeutics that has this precursor stem cell approach. And we hosted this in La Jolla in San Diego. It was back in June 29th. And we were really trying to engage with industry groups to showcase what was in the clinic, make sure that in the audience we had individuals that were, interested in maybe in the future making potential investments and understanding what are the exciting things that are happening in the field. Also under Energize, with engaging with industry, I think it's important for us not to forget that there might be potential therapeutics that can be repositioned into SCI. So, aspirin's a repurposed drug, Viagra's a repurposed drug. There are medication that's out there that was made for a particular indication, but there could be some preliminary data that suggests that it might have some benefit for another indication, such as spinal cord injury. And that's something that we need to leverage. The reason we need to leverage it is that we can speed things up tremendously, because that's work where they probably already have that risky, high-valued clinical data and shown that it's safe, at least in some sectors of the population. So that already gives us a bit of an advantage to then try to move it into SCI. So that's also something that we're exploring. We've been talking to a lot of different companies to see what kind of drugs that they could repurpose into SCI. And then, so that's the Energize pillar. And then finally, the last pillar is Educate. And it's one that might not sound as direct in getting us to a cure, but I think it is, it's very important. Right now, there aren't good incentives for academics and for industry folk to share their data, which is baffling a bit, because the whole basis of science is that you publish your work, you open up your books, you show what you've done so that another scientist can reproduce it in their lab. If they can't reproduce it, they should publish that work and there should be healthy scientific debate. But you need that kind of openness, I think, to really move science forward. The National Institute of Health earlier this year just implemented a policy that if you're going to have a grant from them, you have to have a plan on how you're going to make your data open. And making data open is simply, your Excel sheet that you've collected all that raw data, that goes on this website so that anybody can go in and reanalyze the data, come up with different hypotheses. Maybe that can trigger a partnership. Maybe that can trigger a different interpretation of the data. And the incentives are just not there for this. So at least we do have in the field the infrastructure in place. It's called the Open Data Commons. Other nonprofits have helped put it together. We're right now really making a big push so that it can be used, making sure that the data can get in there. So we've given out a grant to the University of Alberta in Canada. They've hired someone called a data retrieval specialist. They're going to go specifically, physically, into labs that we know have not yet put that data into the Open Data Commons and help educate them on how to format the data in the proper way. Give them the resources that they need, give them the incentives that they need to share their data. And then when I was mentioning about that bottom-up approach of requests for applications, those RFAs, where we make a call out for anybody to apply to us, this is a great opportunity for us to put a request for applications around the analysis of the data that's in the Open Data Commons. So lastly, under educate, we need to make sure that the field has the right research tools so that they can advance their ideas on the lab bench into the clinic. So making sure that there's standardization of different types of SCI model protocols, having what we call contract research organizations. These are, neutral companies that are there to perform work around a particular model. And you can imagine that that can really reduce risk if they exist in the field. And in other indications, they're quite common. But having these contract research organizations within spinal cord injury research is lacking tremendously. But what you would love to see is maybe there's a company that they can afford to sort of build that petri dish model that they have that needs to be established in their lab, but maybe it's already established and Reeve has sort of given a stamp of approval. And so all you need to do is send your potential therapeutics to that contract research organization, and for a fee, they'll do the work, and then you can publish it, and you can move a lot faster. So everything across these three pillars of catalyze, energize, and educate is to reduce risk in doing work in SCI, which will therefore accelerate the research and hopefully get regulatory approval occurring a lot faster for exciting potential therapeutics.
Well, I love this whole idea because it sounds faster. It also sounds safer. And I'm sure that all this data that's collected is all de-identified, so nobody can trace it back to any one individual. So if you participate in one of these, you don't have to feel like anybody will know or be able to find out it was you. So
yeah, and that's a very active conversation in the field, and we need to make sure that everyone's protected with their information. If things are de-identified, then it's almost not even considered human data anymore, because that's sort of removed, and that data can then be placed in these open data repositories. But we need to change the entire culture of sharing data. I think that's the key. And you can get to a point where it starts to flip, where in the beginning there's more risk to share. But then you can imagine that as people start sharing, it becomes riskier not to share. It looks bad on you not to share after a certain point. You can imagine somebody is working at a pharmaceutical company and they're not sharing, and they present on the status of their program, and their leadership will ask them, well, what are your competitors doing? Well, if your competitors are sharing information and working with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation and with other nonprofits, and they're all sitting around the table sharing information, and you're not, now it's riskier not to be sharing. And I think that's where we want to get at in the SCI field.
Making that sea change is a huge job. So thank you for doing that and putting all the effort into doing that you do, as well as other people too. But that's really an important thing. So what do you see right now is the up and coming thing? What is, and times change, things change, science moves along. But right now, what do you see as the most promising thing coming on the horizon for spinal cord injury and paralysis?
Yeah, definitely electrical stimulation. I think that is really the hot area right now. There's different types of electrical stimulation. Broad strokes, there's a less invasive approach called transcutaneous, placing electrodes in the back of the neck in different locations. The company Onward Medical has that approach, They call their platform ARC-EX, EX for external. There's also another platform that Onward Medical has called ARC-IM for implantable. That's the epidural stimulation. And the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation has supported this work right from the early stages work that was done at UCLA, and work that's been, I think, supported across the years to get to the point where you have a company that has a commercialization plan, that has intellectual property, to really try to move it to regulatory approval. And so right now, Onward Medical is the furthest along with the electrical stimulation with their ARC-EX platform, with the transcutaneous, for the purpose of improving hand and arm function. And this is something that they've completed a pivotal trial. So a pivotal trial is one in which you're doing human clinical testing with the right number of people, with the right type of measurements, that you feel that you have a data set that you can then present to a regulatory agency to gain approval so that it can become an accepted treatment, the regulatory agency being the FDA. So they're at a stage where they're aiming to try to get the transcutaneous stimulation approved by the second half of next year. And they've made public statements that they think that that's the right timeline. And then following that would be the epidural stimulation, their ARC-IM approach, where they're looking at movement, and they're also moving into the area of stabilizing blood pressure. And that's probably 2025, 2026, where they're going to be trying to get approval. So electrical stimulation is what kind of got me excited to come into the field, because I saw this as being quite revolutionary. But we know that it's probably not the entire answer. There needs to probably be some type of combination approach, maybe a device and some type of small molecule, or a device and a biologic, or a device and a peptide in combination. But right now, I would say that is by far the most exciting approach, and potentially might get FDA approval next year. So we're all waiting to see where that lands.
And is there any other companies that are working with Reeve that are moving along in the same direction? It seems like there's a lot of different companies that are doing a lot of different things.
Yeah, there's definitely more than Onward Medical that's there. And if you go to the conferences, you see a lot of these companies that are present, like SpineX, like Ennuevo, like Synchron. So all of these companies are, they have, different technologies, different approaches, and that type of competition, I think, is healthy, because we don't know in the end, what's the group that's going to make it across the finish line. So we need to be, supporting the entire ecosystem so that it's a healthy environment for all these companies to move forward.
And one company might have a product that might work better for a specific individual as well. So it's
absolutely, and that's a big thing that's lacking in the field also, is understanding the heterogeneity with individuals living with spinal cord injury. And people are different, and it's possible that you might have a very promising therapeutic, but you test it in the wrong population, and that can kill the whole approach. So this type of patient stratification is really important. And a lot of times the way you achieve that patient stratification is by identifying biomarkers. Just like if you were to try to understand your cardiovascular health, you would be looking at cholesterol levels. We don't really have clear-cut biomarkers within SCI that would give us a better understanding of how the progression of the injury will occur, and how the stratification should occur of the population to go to particular trials. So that's something that I've been talking to a lot of the stakeholders involved, and trying to see what we can do to try to move the needle on that.
Well, that's interesting that you should mention that, because just this month I'm coming out with a blog about biomarkers.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because people hear that word, and I get a lot of confusion about it, because people will say to me, well, Linda, I like, maybe they're taking something for their arthritis, and they'll say, well, I have biomarkers. And I'm like, yes, waiting for and what's the problem with the biomarker. But there's a misunderstanding where they think if they have a biomarker, that is their problem. They have a biomarker. Oh my gosh, this guy's
Okay.
falling.
Yeah, and all a biomarker is more information to help diagnose and to
right,
help predict
how the biomarkers change.
yeah, so when you're doing your
Looking-
blood, when you go to the doctor and you're doing your blood work, all of those results, those are all biological markers that help understand if you have a pathology or not, or how the progression of your pathology is going, and it provides really important information. And for SCI, it could present a lot of really good information so that you can do really smart clinical trials. And I've been saying this quite a bit, that it's really important to have metrics of what we're doing to see if we're successful. Do these three pillars of catalyze, energize, and educate, are they moving the needle? One way would be to check to see how robust the clinical pipeline is for SCI. And robustness can be measured by, do we have more clinical trials than we did, let's say, 5 years ago? Do we have increased diversity of those types of clinical trials? Meaning, are all the trials devices for electrical stimulation? Or are we seeing biologics? Are we seeing gene therapy? Are we seeing small molecules? Are we seeing more shots on goal with the diversity? And then the third, I think, gets to the biomarkers, and it's how smart are those trials, given that most clinical trials fail. That's just a fact. And especially within CNS, for many different reasons, it's very, very difficult for clinical trials to get positive results within work done on the central nervous system. So if they fail, we better make sure that we learn something from that trial. And you have a higher chance of learning something if you understand the mechanism, the biology, and therefore understand the biomarkers that are telling you something about why your therapy failed in that clinical trial.
And I don't think that a lot of people really appreciate the idea, that there's a clinical trial. So you're working with people, and it's still in a trial format.
Yes.
And so there are successes and there are failures in clinical trials. And I don't know that people always really appreciate the fact that a clinical trial could fail. It doesn't mean that whatever you were studying was wrong. It could be that you just gone down the wrong avenue, or it could be that it didn't.
Or you had the wrong population that you were testing. Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I've really noticed when I started at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation is that at times there's also a confusion between a clinical trial, which is research. It's an experiment, primarily to check to see if something's safe, and confusing that with a therapy. You don't have a therapy while you're conducting the clinical trial. You have a potential therapy in the future if the data tells you that things are safe and they're working. But I've seen this confusion between the clinical research and a claim that something works. And I think this hurts the field. And I've been at conferences, and people are starting more to stand up and speak out against that type of mentality, because it needs to come from those folks that are the principal investigators that are running the clinical trial. They need to be very open that as a volunteer for the trial that we're conducting, we don't know if this is going to work. We have a lot of evidence to show that it's very promising, but the reason we're conducting the clinical trial is to test if it's safe, because maybe it's not. And the reason we're conducting the clinical trial is to see if it actually works, because we don't know. And we need to be a lot more open, I think, as clinical trialists, and making that statement, because I do sense that sometimes people join a clinical trial because they think they're going to get some therapy, and really they're participating in the clinical trial with a lot of altruism to help research and to help advance the particular therapy. We lost you, Linda, for a second, but
Yes, I clicked out real quick, so I hope you just went on, and I'm sure you did.
Yeah, that was just my point. It's something that has struck me, of this confusion between a clinical trial and therapy, and I think that's not healthy for the field.
So if somebody wanted to get more involved in clinical trials, first of all, what would be their goal? And how would they get involved in clinical trials? So if somebody's a therapist or a physician out there and they're listening to this webinar and they think, oh, I have some patients that might become interested, how do I advise them on that?
Yeah, so I think you need to get as much information as possible about the particular trial that you might be interested in joining. And again, ideally, you go into it as a volunteer, knowing that this might not help you. And that's just the reality of the process. And it shouldn't be that I want to join this clinical trial because I think it's going to help me in the short term. And I know that's difficult. Everyone, of course, wants things to go faster. That's the basis of our research plan. But the reality of the process is that participating in a trial, you're doing an incredible service to science, an incredible service to getting something, hopefully, that will get regulatory approval so that the general population can benefit from it. A great resource, and again, this might be a good time to put this link up on the chat for everyone to see it. There's something called SCI Trials Finder, and this is a great way to sort of match you to a particular clinical trial that's out there. It doesn't ensure that you would get into the trial. Clinical trials, they have a lot of prerequisites. They also have a lot of exclusion criteria, but it's a good first step when you put in information about your location, about the type of injury you have, when the injury occurred, to see sort of a list of the clinical trials that are out there that you might want to participate in. Without people's participation, we're not going to get to treatments, but we just need to make sure that we're going in eyes wide open and realizing there's risk. That's why the trials are there. One risk, for example, could be that you join a clinical trial, participate in it, and it then might in the future exclude you for another type of trial. That's just the reality of it, and just understanding as much about the trial as possible and seeing if that's the right thing for you if you do want to participate in research, which is an incredible service to the community.
Absolutely. There's a question in the question box here, and somebody's asking, do you have a sense, I'm going to put that in, do you have a sense of the rate of percentage of trials that are helpful versus clinical trials that would be considered a failure or not as successful as people had hoped?
Yeah, so if we define success as anecdotal evidence of an individual, I mean, a lot of trials you will hear anecdotal evidence that something has benefited them, and I completely believe anyone's anecdotal evidence, but I also understand that this is one person's benefit, and that might not generalize to the rest of the population. Right. You can take an example of eating peanut butter and imagine that I was a participant in a peanut butter trial. We didn't know about allergies, and I had the peanut butter and I said it worked great for me. Now, if you test in, 500,000 people, you now might have some deaths that occur. So understanding a success for an individual doesn't generalize to the rest of the population until those clinical trials are actually done that have enough people, and then needs to be monitored when it's on the market. And it just becomes a matter of, having enough numbers to understand where there might be harm and who might be susceptible of getting hurt by potential treatment. Sorry, Linda, what was the other part of the question? Success, a rate of success.
Just the success rate, and I don't know that there is any published specific number. So I think
I think it's something like at least 90% failure rate once you start to get to phase 3 clinical trials within any work that's done on the brain or on the spinal cord. So it's a very, very high attrition rate, unfortunately. And I think there are things that we can do to reduce the attrition that happens. One is a better understanding of biomarkers so that you get the right population. Two, and here again, in talking about our request for applications, something we're probably going to launch in December. I've noticed that a lot of small companies don't have a good understanding of what's called the PK/PD relationship of their therapeutic. So PK stands for pharmacokinetics, PD stands for pharmacodynamics. So these are like big words simply to describe the relationship between what the body does to a drug, how a body absorbs it, metabolizes it, distributes it, excretes it, understanding that relationship and how that's related to the outcome that you're measuring. All of this is necessary and usually done upfront by big pharma companies. Smaller companies either don't have the resources to do it upfront, they might not have the expertise, but it becomes the basis of conducting really good clinical trials when you understand that relationship. And here I'm talking specifically about an oral, let's say an oral medication that you would take. It's the way that you know when you have medication to take, if it's going to be once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, once a week, all that understanding of the dosing. A lot of that work is I've been seeing a sort of lacking in the field. I think there aren't a lot of incentives in the short term. So we want to, launch a request for applications for small companies, and they can be paired with academic groups or with large pharma, so that they can build those data sets and get a better understanding. If you have a better understanding, you increase the chances of success in the clinic, because now you really understand the dose that you should be using for the particular outcome that you want to get a measure. And I know that sounds kind of simple, but sometimes that relationship is not fully understood when you go into the clinic, and therefore you get really high attrition rates and you got a lot of failures.
So it's very complicated. Research is very
It's complicated. Yeah, I don't want it to make it sound complicated, but just a basic understanding, just like when you take medication, knowing that it's once a day versus knowing that that's once a week. That's work that was done very, very early on. And it really gets at an understanding of what the body is doing to the medication, and then relating on how you're getting the right doses to get your right effect. We take it for granted when we take our medication, but that's the type of work that a lot of times smaller companies, they don't do it up front. And the longer you wait, you might be going down the wrong path, and therefore you might be getting failure once you get into the clinic.
So switching gears a little bit, you had mentioned that eStim is a big thing that, we all know about that. That's a huge thing that's on the docket for upcoming improvement for people with paralysis. Are there any other things that you see out there on the horizon that might be interesting, that maybe aren't that far along, but they seem to have some positive thoughts behind them?
Yeah. I think there's several. Again, going back to that link of the SCI symposium, you can see presentations from 5 other companies that are not doing epidural stimulation work. And they all have, slightly different approaches to treating spinal cord injury. So you have 2 large companies, AbbVie and Mitsubishi, which are targeting something called RGMA, which sort of promotes a lot of inhibitory actions to prevent the neurons and the axons from growing. And they have a biologics approach. Biologic usually in this case would mean an antibody approach. And these antibodies, they kind of look like a Y, and the 2 top portions of sort of the letter Y of the antibody will then bind to these molecules called RGMA and prevent them from doing that inhibition. So you got 2 large pharma companies, AbbVie and Mitsubishi, that are doing work on that website. You can hear their talks and where they are with their clinical trial research. That's more for acute stage of SCI. You also have a company called NerveGen, and again, the presentation is there on the website. They have a peptide approach. So a peptide is a large protein. That's different from when you hear a small molecule approach. Small molecule can get through the blood spinal barrier a lot easier than a peptide, but they've created the peptide in a way that from a injection into the skin, it can get into the spinal cord. And again, that's getting at again, those inhibitory signals and preventing that from continuing to propagate. There's really interesting work being done by this French company, EG427, and they have a gene therapy approach where they're encoding a portion of botulism toxin in a viral carrier for neurogenic bladder. So it's a very innovative new kind of approach that they're doing. And then the hosts of the meeting, Lineage Cell Therapeutics, they have a precursor stem cell approach. So yes, stem cells, which are fully what are called pluripotent, which simply means they can become anything. These cells can become any type of cell. When you're dealing with a precursor stem cell, it's a little bit more targeted already to a particular type of end product of what it's going to become. In this case, with Lineage Cell Therapeutics, it's going to become an oligodendrocyte, which will help with the myelin sheath that goes around the axons to help insulate an axon so you could get proper electrical stimulation passing through it. So I welcome everybody to explore it. They're fascinating talks. They're all in the clinic, and they're making good progress. And hopefully this is something which, if they get approval, maybe potentially it can get paired with all of the exciting electrical stimulation work that's being done right now.
So in the future, probably all of this is going to work together in some way, shape, or form. And we have to wait and see what that is going to be.
Yeah, we have to wait and see, and we have to push that people start talking to each other earlier than later.
Mm-hmm.
It would be hard for me to believe that everyone's sort of in a silo for years and years and years, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, now let's try to combine these therapies together. I think just common sense would say that that's not the best approach. How do we get groups to already start collaborating very early on to understand potential synergy in the future, I think is something that we need to push harder for.
And that's a huge mindset change. Here's some questions from the audience. There's several questions. First of all, there are a lot of questions, so I want everybody to know if you don't hear your specific question, I probably combined it with another question because there are so many, we would never get through all of these. But there's several questions about research with transverse myelitis, autoimmune disease, immunity, that kind of thing. Can you relate that to treatment for paralysis?
Yeah, I think a lot of these things are getting at the secondary parts of the injury that then trigger immune responses. And so you do have researchers that are very much now focused on the immune system and how that could benefit or hurt an individual with an injury. So we're supporting some work by a researcher in Canada that's sort of looking at inflammation and seeing what are its potential benefits to sort of increase inflammatory responses and what parts of increasing the inflammatory responses can actually hurt the individual. So there's a lot of, I think, ongoing research around the immune system in general that would get at that. I don't know specifically of where we are with that type of research, but there's definitely activity there.
But it does go on. Somebody is
actually, I'm just seeing on the webinar chat, someone asked if anyone's heard about NVG291 from NerveGen. So that's one of the talk. That's the one that they have a peptide approach, and the NerveGen talk is in the SCI symposium link.
Okay, so good tip there. So family member writes in, and how can they support their loved one besides financial support? How can they support them in perhaps participating in research or finding research? What can family members do to help?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. I mean, we're all in this together, and
Mhm.
this mentality, which when I was in industry, the mentality was we're going to get a treatment for people living with Parkinson's, and we don't really need much of their input. And that's changed considerably. And I think there's now an understanding that we need to be hearing as much as possible from individuals living with spinal cord injury so that we could understand what are the right outcome measures, what's important to the individual. So working with different nonprofits, working with us in in sharing that type of information. A lot of times we're trying to find individuals to help us with scientific reviews so that they can provide their input of what's feasible, or if you have a science background, combining your scientific input with what you think is actually going to be feasible for somebody living with SCI. That's also a great way to help us. And then lastly, participation in research. And again, I think going to that SCI Trials Finder. But again, just going in with eyes wide open that this is something that might not help you in the immediate future, but will definitely help the entire field in volunteering for research.
Okay. Here's a person that writes it in. Is it true that more spinal tumors are being found in the elderly, and does anybody know why?
I don't know. I don't know why. I
I
didn't
don't,
know that that was that
well, I
that was
know there's that, older people have more cancers than younger people, so it's
true.
probably related to something metabolic in that way, I would assume. A young man, 17 years post, says his healing has slowed down. Is it too late to go back to rehab? And he took so long to learn to use a spoon and to advance. So would more rehab help him? And I think we've kind of talked about the e-stim. He sounds like a perfect person for that. And that's coming out right around the corner. So it's
Yeah,
not.
and it's something that I forgot to mention too, that when we talk about a combinatorial strategy and combining two approaches, in a sense, it's already happening because any type of clinical trial is always adding the rehab component. And in fact, without the rehab component, I think a lot would argue that maybe the treatment wouldn't work. So the epidural stimulation in combination with rehab is pretty crucial. And I think most clinical trials always have that component of rehab. So I guess a combinatorial approach really is talking about at least maybe three things that need to be added. You already have the rehab, you have the primary therapy, and then is there a tertiary approach that needs to be added?
Okay. There's a lot of questions in here, and this is the question, Marco. I want a definitive answer. When will all this be ready? Now, I know I'm just teasing you,
Yeah,
but
no,
there's a lot of questions in here. Exactly when will the
yeah,
cure come?
yeah.
So what are
I
your
think
thoughts on that?
I think we can learn from other indications like take the cancer field, which they've just had a just a huge revolution in understanding that there are different types of cancer. They really understand the differences between people with different types of cancer, and then how to treat it. So my personal opinion is that ideally what we see in the next 5 years is sort of this revolution of how electrical stimulation, both transcutaneous and epidural, will be working for different populations. And some, it might be more successful than with others. And that would probably be the most immediate thing that would happen. So I'm hoping that next year we already see transcutaneous stimulation being approved. I think within the next 3 to 5 years, we get a better understanding of how epidural stimulation will be helping. And then everything we do at the foundation is to speed things up so that we're not going to be waiting another 10, 20 years for another treatment.
Well, I think everybody appreciates that your answer, as well as the let's speed things up. Everybody is always looking for that. There's a person here that writes in, why do you think it's difficult to join a working group of people working on neuromotor function with non-scientists? So people who are non-scientists who are
Yeah.
working on recovery strategies. What's your thought on that?
And why is it difficult for those types of collaborations to
Mhm.
happen? Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, when I was in industry, that just didn't happen at all. And I think, to be honest, there's sort of a mentality that, the scientists know better. But I think that's really going away. And I think the understanding now is that we need to gain as much information as possible to be able to move something along. And the way you do that is very early on get input from individuals that are living with SCI. And I see companies do that. Like I've seen workshops that Onward Medical has done at scientific conferences where they open up the floor and really hear input from people. And they've heard input, for example, maybe don't spend so much time doing research on movement and walking that doesn't look natural, and maybe focus more on blood pressure, or what are you doing on bladder? And I think they're listening. And I think other companies will listen too. Yeah.
I think that has improved greatly through my career. It's certainly different than how it was years ago. Any progress with chronic pain syndrome, which frequently accompanies SCI? Anything going on in that?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of companies that have been reaching out to us around chronic pain and seeing what they could do with just general chronic back pain, and looking to see if they can move into the SCI field. And we've been talking to these groups. I think pain must be up there as one of the top unmet needs. Probably pain, then bladder and bowel function, maybe coming in second. And it's underrepresented, I think, in the research. So that's definitely on our radar, and we're trying to do more on that.
Trying to get more on that. Okay. Now here's a question in Spanish, which I do not speak, but I can derive from this question, and this is my interpretation, so bear with me. Epidural stimulation on lower motor neuron individuals. So there, that has been traditionally, well, it doesn't, people with lower motor injury don't stimulate, but there is some research that says there's effects from doing the stimulation with lower motor. Do you have any thoughts or feelings about that? Any research going on about that?
Yeah, I don't think I know enough of that research to be able to.
I know, especially in the pediatrics.
Even in English, I can't reply.
No, okay. I know even in pediatrics, they're looking at that. And so there is some research, but it's little isolated pockets going around. It's not something that's like overwhelming us with data here. I heard about, this is a question, I heard about research with an injection that helped nerves reconnect in people with spinal cord injury. So I think maybe you were talking about that with the Y. Was that an injection, or was that a?
Yeah, those I believe are injections. What's being done with Lineage is also injection. So I don't know specifically what they're referring to, but there are different approaches, either through biologics or through these different types of stem cells that are injectables that are being tested in the clinic.
Okay, now we've talked about function, and we've talked about bowel and bladder. We hit on the subject of pain. We haven't talked about skin and pressure injury. Is there anything that's going on with?
Oh, Linda, I don't know if you froze. Did you freeze?
Hey, Marco, it's Julie. Yes, she might have froze again, so I'm just gonna give her a minute to come back. She might disappear and come back. So
Yeah.
I don't even know what the question was.
Yeah. The short answer there is that I don't think there's enough being done around skin and pressure. I'm not aware of what sort of the leading work that's being done in that area. That's something that I can explore more and try to build it into our portfolio.
And I would have everybody go to ChristopherReeve.org and click on Tomorrow's Cure. And everything that Marco has talked about in this webinar, you can find there. His pillars and all of that we're funding, and all of our partners as well and initiatives can be found there. And Linda, welcome back.
I know, I apologize for that yet again. Anyway, that was the end of all the questions, ironically, so there we go. Any 3 last comments you'd like to make about research and paralysis? What are your 3 take-home messages that we need to know?
Yeah, I think the first one's that we're all in this together, and there are many different stakeholders that need to be at the table, including individuals living with SCI. And if we, I think we'd be very naive to think that one group, one academic group, one industry group alone can get to the answer. And I think we all need to work together. I think we all need to just make sure that when we're thinking about participating in research, that we try to get as much information as possible before doing it, and not to see the research as a therapy, but it is, an experiment, and a very important one that needs to be done, and tremendous service to the community to participate in it. And lastly, I think, we're going to do everything we can so that people are not working in silos, and really share the information that they have. And I truly believe that can accelerate science, and we're seeing what the NIH is doing, and we're going to apply a lot of pressure to make sure that we break down those barriers.
Sounds great. Dr. Marco Baptista, thank you very much for coming on the webinar today. We've all learned a lot. We've gathered a lot of information. You're such an excellent resource, and we're just so happy to have you here at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Foundation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to do a little homework on some of these questions also, so we can continue the conversation. And I appreciate it very much.
All right, thank you.
And this is Julie from the Reeve Foundation. Just want to remind everybody to take the post-event survey, and also something very important going on in our foundation. Would you please sign up to be an advocate at christopherreeve.org/advocacy, so you can follow on all things going on in our foundation and help us fight for the rights of our community. Thank you so much.